Presentation originally done at our spring spin conference. Our presentation is titled Behind the Curtain, Autism and OCD. And my name is Dr. Maya Matheis, and I am accompanied by Jessica McCullum. We're going to go ahead and get started and we'll do some introductions. So first, my name is Dr. Maya. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my specialization is in the assessment of neurodevelopmental disorders, as well as mental health treatment and support for neurodivergent individuals, both young and old, all across the lifespan. And I'll let Jessica introduce herself.
My name is Jessica McCullum. I am the founder of a local 501c3 nonprofit here on Hawaii Island called Autism Moms of Kona. And I am the mother of a child with both autism spectrum disorder, profound autism, she is non-speaking, and also co-occurring OCD.
So we are going to go over today's agenda first. Our first topic is going to be about how to think about both OCD and autism separately as well as together. We'll look at the similarities and differences, diagnostic considerations, treatment considerations, and we'll wrap up with some resources, both for families and for providers in the community. So first, I'm going to start with OCD. So OCD stands for Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. This is something that is fairly common in our lexicon. We often talk about being a little OCD when people are very neat or particular about things. But it's a mental health condition that is defined by intrusive thoughts, also known as obsessions, and repetitive behaviors, also known as compulsions. And these are a little bit different. You notice that repetitive behavior terminology also occurs a lot when we talk about autism. But these repetitive behaviors are engaged in specifically to reduce anxiety related to the obsessions. And individuals who have these sort of obsessions and compulsions often experience significant distress. And that significant distress is an important component for the diagnostic process in considering OCD for an individual. So autism or ASD, autism spectrum disorder, is a neurodevelopmental condition, and we define it by differences in social communication as well as repetitive behaviors. And because of that spectrum terminology, right, we've begun to understand it as a really broad range of presentations where each individual can present very differently from others. Looking specifically in on OCD, because I think most people viewing this presentation will be fairly familiar with autism and maybe not as familiar with OCD. I want to go into a bit more detail in defining what I mean by these obsessions and compulsions. So obsessions are these really sort of intrusive, unwanted thoughts or images or urges that pop up in your mind, right? Like they just come in, they interrupt whatever is happening for you, and they cause the stress and anxiety for the individual. Compulsions are what the individual feels like they need to engage in to reduce the anxiety and distress that they're feeling from these obsessions. And so the key to understanding OCD is the link between these obsessions and compulsions. On the right hand, I have a really nice little illustration. It's from an artist who has a website, OCD Doodles, which I encourage people to check out. Some really, really beautiful visuals to help kind of illustrate these concepts. But this is just a nice little visual showing this idea that, you know, the obsessions lead to anxiety, which lead to the compulsions, which lead to relief, temporary relief. But then the obsessions kind of pop back in and the whole cycle starts again. And this is a cycle that sort of reinforces the use of compulsions as a way of coping with the anxiety. And so it's really reinforcing this link, right, between the obsessions and the compulsions for the individual. Here are some common types of OCD obsessions. I think it's also important to note that some of these obsessions are happening completely internal for an individual. They might not be talking about these thoughts, and you might not know that they're having these thoughts. But very common categories include things related to contamination, germs, harm or violence, symmetry, how things are arranged or having things just right, things that are moral or religious in nature, kind of thinking about, am I sinning? Am I a bad person? Sexual or inappropriate thoughts, as well as health anxiety, so getting sick or other people getting sick as well. And again, some more little OCD doodles just illustrating some of these concepts. The compulsions that are linked to obsessions are typically more visible. So these are things that people are engaging in. These are behaviors, so they're outwardly visible. But sometimes they can also be mental compulsions that are happening internally. That there may be some way of kind of seeing that the person is doing it. Maybe they're zoned out, muttering to themselves, etc. But sometimes they're invisible as well. So these include things like cleaning and washing, which you can see there's a connection there maybe to obsessions about cleanliness or germs or getting sick. Checking things are locked, doors are closed, repeating actions a certain number of times, so touching things a certain number of times, etc. Arranging and ordering, mental compulsions like counting or ordering things alphabetically in your mind, as well as seeking reassurance over and over from other people. And if you're looking at this list, you're probably recognizing that some of these overlap with repetitive behaviors that we frequently see in individuals with autism, such as arranging and ordering, right? We know that a lot of individuals with autism will engage in types of play where they're arranging objects, or they have a particular way where they want their belongings set up, and so on. So the trick here comes in saying, okay, what's the difference between these OCD compulsions versus the autistic repetitive behaviors? So just to sum up what we've talked about with OCD, another really nice OCD doodle. So up on top of this image, we have these intrusive thoughts, right? These are all of the things that are kind of interrupting our thought process, interrupting our feelings, interrupting our, anything that we're engaged in the moment. These are those images, these ideas, urges, memories, questions that kind of come in, which lead to distress. These can then lead to these compulsions, which are driven by a desire to relieve the anxiety and distress that they're feeling. And these compulsions could be overt behaviors or mental rituals, like we talked about. And these compulsions generally lead to this feeling of relief, right? It reduces the distress, it reduces the anxiety, which then reinforces this whole cycle again. So this is a kind of nice way of showing the link between obsessions and compulsions and how all of this is feeding into each other. I have a bit of information about the prevalence and rates related to OCD and autism. And I think this is really important because when we're talking about these conditions, we really want to be thinking about what does this mean for people? And statistics, while sometimes kind of boggling your mind or being a little bit scientific in nature, really give us information on what this means for people in the community. So I'll interpret these for you. So in the general population, we estimate that approximately 2.3% of individuals have OCD. And this doesn't mean that they're diagnosed with OCD, just an estimate of how many people we think probably have OCD that could be diagnosed. But if we look only at individuals on the autism spectrum, we see that this prevalence rate jumps up significantly to between 17 and 37% of individuals with autism having OCD. And so here we see a really stark difference, right? It's much more likely that an individual with autism has OCD versus a neurotypical person. So this is actually a fourfold increased risk, which means someone on the autism spectrum is 4 times more likely having OCD than someone who's neurotypical. Um, and this goes in reverse too, right? If you have OCD, you're more likely to have autism, vice versa. And so this just shows that these conditions often go hand in hand. Unfortunately, though, even though we know they go hand in hand, A lot of people don't know very much about how to understand OCD in this population, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So because there's this increased statistical likelihood, um, scientists have kind of looked at that question and said, like, why? Why is this? What is this overlap? What are the similarities? And so in neurobiology research, we've actually found that there are very similar neural pathways in the brain that are related to both conditions. And this is specifically in relation to something called the CSTC, or the corticostriatal thalamocortical circuit. And this is a circuit in the brain, which means that it's a pathway um, connecting different parts of the brain that's frequently used for specific reasons. And this pathway is used in terms of cognitive control, motor output, as well as behavioral flexibility. And both autism and OCD show a higher activation of activity in this circuit in the brain. We also have found that when looking at neurotransmitters, so these are the chemicals that are being released in synapses in your brain that communicate between your neurons. So how your brain is sending messages across itself. These neurotransmitters show differences or dysregulation both in the serotonic and the glutamatergic systems. So, serotonin is known to regulate mood, anxiety, and sleep, and glutamate is known to regulate learning and memory. Both of these neurotransmitters show different rates of firing in the brain in autistic and OCD brains versus neurotypical brains. So we know there's some neurobiological overlap. And I think this is really important because often when we talk about mental health and developmental diagnoses, they're these separate, distinct boxes, right? You check one, you check the other. They're considered totally separate things. But in reality, we know a lot is happening in the brain in the same places. There's a lot of overlap. And so the boundary between these conditions is a lot fuzzier than our diagnostic criteria would like it to be. Hopefully, over time, with more research, we'll better understand that, but this is kind of where we are right now. So there are a lot of similarities neurologically, and there are also a lot of similarities in terms of how they present. So even though autism is defined by social differences, we know that people with OCD also can struggle with social interactions. And we also see repetitive behaviors in both, as well as a need for routine, people finding comfort in things that are very routine based. So here I have a Venn diagram that shows some of these repetitive behaviors. We tend to see certain types of repetitive behaviors in autism and OCD, but there are definitely some in this overlap area. So like I said, with OCD, some of the things that we commonly see are things like checking locks, appliances, if they're locked or on off, excessive cleaning, excessive hand washing, counting to yourself silently, silently praying, and repetitive reassurance seeking. And these are repetitive behaviors that we associate more with OCD. And on the right side, we have a list of repetitive behaviors that we frequently see associated with autism. So these include body movements like rocking or hand flapping, object-focused play, echolalia, so repeating after other people, scripting, from media or from music, special interests, sensory seeking behaviors, collecting items, listing things when you're speaking, as well as memorizing facts. And this is often related to a special interest. So these are repetitive behaviors that we really only see with autism and not OCD. But in the middle, this overlap, there are quite a few things, right? Here we have routines, rituals, resistance to change, repeated actions, and arranging or ordering. And these could be associated with either or both. How do we differentiate if a repetitive behavior is more autistic or OCD in nature? So we're going to look at four different things: the purpose of the behavior, the emotions that accompanying it, the trigger before the behavior occurs, and the insight that the individual has about it. So, repetitive behaviors that occur related to autism are typically things that the person enjoys. They are self-soothing, they provide some sort of sensory input, and they usually result in an emotional state of being calm or regulated after they engage in these behaviors. And there is sometimes distress, but that's typically associated if they're interrupted or stopped from engaging in these repetitive behaviors that are enjoyable and that bring them maybe a sense of equilibrium in their body or give them some sensory input that they're craving or just are fun. The trigger for these repetitive behaviors is usually something in the sensory environment, an internal state, like maybe the person is starting to feel dysregulated, so they want to engage in this behavior to calm themselves down, or an interest in the environment. The toys are available that you really like to play with, and then so you're going to play with them the way you like, which maybe is lining them up. Uh, Insight, typically people are aware of what they're doing, but they're not concerned about it. These are things that are fun for them, they enjoy doing them, and it's not a bother to them. It might bother other people, but that's a completely different story, right? For these individuals, these are um, pleasant, enjoyable activities that they are happy to engage in. And we also don't want to conflate this with um, these sort of behaviors that people engage in to calm themselves down, right? They might be agitated beforehand, but that agitation is unrelated to the compulsion that's tied to that action. So that's a little of a distinction we're trying here. So with OCD, the repetitive behaviors, we know that the purpose here is to reduce anxiety from the obsessive thoughts. And so what we see is a high level of emotional distress before the behavior. So this is where it gets tricky, right? So someone might be dysregulated with an autistic repetitive behavior that they choose to calm themselves down. The difference is that if they are interrupted, it's because they're not able to make themselves calm. If someone is interrupted doing an OCD repetitive behavior, the distress comes from not being able to finish their ritual, not because of a calm state that they derive from it being, interrupted or anything like that, but because they can't complete it. Because there's this compulsion of needing to do it. And it's that needing to do it function that is a little different here. Um, the trigger here is not something in the environment, but rather a specific intrusive thought or image, an obsession that comes beforehand. And remember, these obsessions are inside someone's head, so we can't see this happen. Usually, people with OCD do not want to be engaging in these repetitive behaviors. They're distressing for the person, even though they feel good afterwards. The act of doing them is anxiety inducing and it doesn't feel good. And often people recognize that they're doing something too much. They're washing things too much. They know that they shouldn't be praying this much, but they feel like they have to and they can't kind of get out of that cycle. So in some, autistic repetitive behaviors are enjoyable, and those from OCD are really distressing for the individual. And so that's the key takeaway that I want people to have from this discussion. There is a lot of, fine nuance here, and that's because of that fuzziness, right, between the conditions. It's not a distinct hard wall between these that we're seeing. So there is a little fuzziness, and so some people are like, "Oh, but what about this? What about this?" And yeah, it's all kind of mixed up in the middle. But really what we're focusing on if something is enjoyable versus if something is distressing. I'm going to pass it over to Jessica for this section.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Maya. So, after all of that information and working closely with Dr. Maya on the differences between autism and OCD, I was able to identify the differences of Ava's profound autism and her co-occurring OCD. So we learned early on with Ava about her restrictive and repetitive behaviors. She was diagnosed with autism very early in her life. She was immediately referred to early intervention at 18 months and then received a diagnosis shortly thereafter. So we were very familiar with the restrictive and repetitive behaviors that came with autism, but it took a while to understand and differentiate the function of the behavior. So as a parent, that has been, consistently involving Ava in occupational therapy or ABA or different behavioral interventions, I learned a lot about what is the reason that is triggering or causing that behavior? What is the function of the behavior? So, as Dr. Maya had mentioned, the difference from OCD, which is really you're looking at ways with which Ava's trying to reduce distress in her life versus restrictive and repetitive behaviors that might lead to comforting, enjoyable, or regulating feelings from a sensory perspective. And so as she got older, we started to see an increase of certain OCD tendencies as a result just of her growing and learning new skills, but also developing natural human behaviors like anxiety and things like that. So on the left-hand side, specific situations where Ava was trying to reduce distress was she was trying to neutralize that fear with her riding in a car. So, of course, when Ava got tall enough and old enough, she was able to sit in the front seat of the car. And as we all know, that can be quite an overwhelming experience. You see the full scope of the road, you're noticing cars more often in front of you and to the sides of you, and you're really getting a better measure for speed. And so that was really, really overwhelming for her. Unfortunately, I have two other kids that needed to sit in the back seat, so there was no other option for us. But that's really where I realized that she was fearful of being in the front seat. So she started to have restricted or like those OCD tendencies when she would get in the car. So part of it was tapping on her seatbelt, and when she would tap on her seatbelt, she had this like tendency to tap her seatbelt 3 times, or she'd like tap and click her seatbelt when making sure it's secure 3 times as well. In addition to that, she would get very impatient about getting in the car and going to the destination. And so, as we were strapping in the baby in the car seat or we were waiting for somebody to get in the car, she was in her own way telling everybody to hurry up. So she would open and close the door. But again, she would open and close the door 3 times, just very impatient, like, come on, let's get going. Um, Other instances where she's kind of had these types of behaviors is when she's eating. So, whenever she's eating, she has a lot of interoceptive needs. So, let me define interoception for you. So, interoception is the sense that helps you feel and understand your internal bodily signals, such as hunger, thirst, pain. Sometimes you can even feel, or it seems like you can hear your heartbeat. It also involves the need to use the bathroom or not recognizing that you need to go to the bathroom. And so in this situation, Ava tends to be under responsive to her interoceptive needs. She doesn't realize when she's full, so she tends to overeat. And when she drinks a ton of water, so it's like she's in the middle of the Sahara Desert and she's constantly drinking water. On the other end of it as well, potty training has been very challenging and difficult because she cannot, though she has challenges with communication, she's also not receiving those internal cues of when she needs to use the restroom. And so she'll oftentimes have accidents. And so when it comes to eating, because she likes to overeat, she's constantly tapping her plate because she wants another serving. She's like, I haven't had enough food yet. But again, it's tapping in threes. And it's that distress that she needs more food. She's starving. And it's really stressful sometimes as a parent, but overall, our duty to her is to make sure she has a healthy and balanced diet and reasonable portion sizes. So it's something that we've worked together to overcome. The other thing that we've realized again with that interoception is that when she's distressed, and she feels like she's not getting enough water or sensory input, then she starts to create a lot of salivation. And so she, spits a lot and creates a lot of foam in her mouth because that's what she then uses to try to play with water, or, it's just like her body's really distressful. So it's actually creating that salivation so that she can stim on her own, salivation. So I found that interesting as well. And then lastly, when she was a lot younger, she was an eloper. So for those of you that don't know what elopement is, it's the tendency to wander off. Alternatively, you can just dart at like 50 miles per hour through Target and just like you see those parents running after the children. It's a real deal. So, she was a super speed runner. It was very challenging for me in the earlier years, but with time and therapy, she has overcome a lot of the tendencies to elope, which can be dangerous, especially if she's darting through a parking lot. But how she copes with that internal feeling that she needs to elope, almost that fight or flight, is that she's constantly checking the doors. And so she's constantly like opening and shutting her bathroom or her bedroom door to make sure that she can go into her bedroom or come out of her bedroom. It's like that sense of a need for autonomy and freedom. And then again, when she was younger, we would have to put like a little extra lock on the top so she couldn't unlock the front door. And so again, she's going to the front door a lot of the times now and just trying to check to see if she has that freedom to wander outside. Even though she no longer elopes, she's remembering that distress and still trying to have some sense of control with her environment. But on the other end of the spectrum, so to speak, she has all of these repetitive behaviors that bring her joy. And so, stimming behavior, she's very big with oral input or oral sensory input. And so, a lot of the time, she's tapping her teeth with all different types of toys. She's rocking back and forth, and one of her favorite sensory tools is a rocking chair. Or as grandpa always calls it, she's counting her rice. So again, with her food, she loves picking up her food and throwing it down and really feeling it in her fingertips before she puts it in her mouth. And then other than that, she does have some proprioception needs. So with proprioception, again, she tends to be under responsive with her sensory system. Proprioception is the body's ability to sense its position, movement, or force, basically knowing where your body parts are without needing to look at them. So it's sometimes called the body awareness sense, and it helps you to do things like walk without looking at your feet, or touching your nose with your eyes closed, or applying the right amount of pressure when you're picking up a drinking glass, or even maintaining like upright balance and coordination as you're walking. And so individuals that have challenges with proprioception, they may be clumsy and constantly be tripping or banging into things. They may have poor posture and constantly be needing to like lay down on the couch, or they have difficulty sitting still. And seeking deep pressure. So Ava really loves, like squeezes, giant bear hugs, head squeezes, and weighted blankets. But furthermore, what a lot of people don't know is a lot of autistic people love water because of this need to feel like they're constantly having that input all over their body. So being in water feels like it's a giant hug, and it's very, very regulating for individuals, for everybody, but especially those that are dysregulated in this particular sense. And so one of her favorite things to do, which can be disastrous, is she'll take food and she'll constantly be plugging our bathroom sinks because she's trying to fill up the sink so that she can have a little play pool where she can play with water. And so again, it's not really that she's trying to be destructive, and she's not distressed either. She's just trying to create access to something that brings her joy and also helps her to stay regulated. And so in that sense, that's really where I differentiate between OCD and then autism. Other behaviors will be organizing by color. She likes to organize different things in the order of the rainbow, which is very fun. And then lastly, playing with balloons or figurines. So she's constantly, again, tossing up her toys, tapping them, throwing them off of high places, and she likes to hear the sounds, and that's her way of playing. So just raising Ava, those are the differences, and I hope that helps you to kind of identify some of the behaviors and the reasons or the function of why that behavior is happening.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay, so now we're going to move into diagnostic considerations. I talked before about these boxes and how we tend to think about them as really separate in the diagnostic process, but there's lots of fuzziness. So I want to kind of talk about like, why is this important? Why are we talking about diagnosis? Why do we want to differentiate between these two conditions? It's because they need very different types of supports. So if someone has autism, but they also have OCD, it's important to recognize that OCD so that they can receive the supports and interventions specific to those types of repetitive behaviors. And this is really difficult because sometimes they go unnoticed or unrecognized because of that overlap that we see. There's this risk of diagnostic overshadowing where we think that, oh, they're autistic, and we don't consider other mental health conditions for that person. And this is something that the our field has been guilty for a long time. It used to be that someone with intellectual disability could not be diagnosed with depression or anxiety, which is ridiculous. These are just human emotions, and we know that these individuals experience these at really high levels sometimes because of their quality of life or because they actually have a tendency towards some of these mental health conditions as well. And I think this is really important, right, when we're thinking about the higher prevalence rate of OCD in this population too. We should be looking for OCD more amongst autistic individuals than we are. And we really need these comprehensive assessments. Diagnoses are important in our medical system, not only because it kind of tells us what the intervention is and allows us access to it, but also because of our healthcare system. We need to bill for that diagnosis to receive certain types of services and have them be approved by insurance company. So even if you suspect that your child has OCD tendencies, having a diagnosis is sometimes necessary to receive the mental health supports for that condition. You can't just sort of receive them without that diagnosis. And that's, you know, another topic for another presentation, but that's why these comprehensive assessments are really important. Um, you know, before I move on, unfortunately, we do not have a lot of people who are trained in both mental health and developmental conditions. And this is just the truth of our field. Things are very siloed. Developmental conditions and mental health systems, we have very different service systems. We have very different training programs for these providers. There's not a lot of overlap. And this is something that I'm hoping to bridge, through my work and also with this presentation. So in assessing for OCD in non-speaking individuals, there are a lot of additional barriers besides the way that our health system is set up, as well as the understanding of OCD and autism. It's sometimes very difficult to detect OCD symptoms if someone isn't able to verbally describe and express what's happening internally for them. And without that sort of feedback from that individual about what they're experiencing, the behaviors that they're doing may be misinterpreted as repetitive behaviors related to autism. And for this reason, we rely very heavily on sort of the behavioral cues happening around these behaviors, as well as caregiver input. So Jessica was talking about Ava, right? Jessica is an Ava expert. She knows all of Ava's behavior. She knows these routines, these patterns. She also has this sense of her daughter's emotional state beyond just the behaviors that she's seeing, right? And she has that sort of intuition of when her daughter is distressed. All of that information is really crucial for kind of differentiating if one of these repetitive behaviors is distressing for the individual versus if it's sensory related, if it's comforting, if it's enjoyable. And so caregiver input becomes really the main focus in the assessment process for these individuals.
And I do want to add, in addition to it being crucial for understanding what Ava is experiencing and with different emotional states, it's important to provide caregiver input, but it's also important to advocate for your child's needs because you're going to be in certain environments like in the school or in the doctor's office or even out in the community where people are not really understanding. And when it comes to being the parent and the caregiver, and I'm her mom, I know exactly how she's feeling because I've raised her since she's been inside of my body. And so, I guess I just wanted to share like it's crucial for you to be able to advocate on behalf of your children, especially within the schools and the educational settings, and with those that are providing care for your children, like all of your therapists. And so that kind of leads into this next arena. Ava is non-speaking. There's a large portion of the autistic population that do not have the ability to speak. A lot of people say the words nonverbal, but it's important for us, and I learned this a few years ago. It's important for us to presume competence for that individual. And by presuming competence, that means that even though Ava can't speak, that doesn't mean that she doesn't understand or that she doesn't have the need to communicate in different ways and that she doesn't have the cognitive abilities or intellectual abilities to be able to interact with others. And so, people with profound autism often experience stigma due to their disabilities, which in turn creates barriers to social inclusion and quality care. And so it's up to us as a community that really embraces neurodiversity and really supports those with the most profound disabilities to educate, to advocate, and to presume competence and not to undermine any ability that Ava might have just because she can't speak. She's getting older, she's going to be a teenager, she has normal human emotions, and we need to give her that equal chance for the human experience, and she deserves human connection. So, going back to nonverbal communication, it's increasingly important to support an individual with nonverbal communication methods, such as those using an AAC device or a PEC system instead of words, because we want to validate their expressive communication. We want to share with them, like, I hear what you're trying to communicate. Instead of I hear what you're saying, I understand you might be frustrated or upset, and I am here for you. And at the same time, I am trying my best to create ways for you to be seen, not only with us, to be heard, not only with us, but with everybody else in your world, in our world. And so, again, it's about validating that expressive communication, which then reinforces communication. It then encourages her to reach out and really express herself and build those relationships with others. But at the end of the day, if you can imagine being a non-speaking individual and really having an excessive amount of challenges with people understanding you. And sorry, I'm getting emotional. If you can imagine being in that situation, of course she's going to be distressed. Of course she's going to be dysregulated. And so that anxiety is going to be increasing. So with age, we constantly see this flood of OCD and stimming and what most people call problem behaviors. But that's just her need to be seen, heard, and inclusion. So, like included. So I believe truly that social inclusion and acceptance is the key to truly supporting somebody struggling with autism and co-occurring conditions such as OCD or anxiety or depression.
Thank you, Jessica. I was getting a little teary when I was hearing you speak to you. Thank you so much for your advocacy for Ava and speaking about how to advocate for this population. It's so important. Um, So let's move on to continue talking about assessment, right? So I mentioned caregiver input. How do we do this? Basically, just ask a lot of questions, get as much information as possible. And so these are just some examples of some of the questions that I ask caregivers and that other providers can use either screening questions in this process or in the diagnostic process if you're a diagnostic clinician. Um, and some of these are ones that I talked with. I asked Jessica when we were first talking about this presentation, right, about Ava. So, are there intrusive thoughts or images causing distress? And sometimes a parent does know this, even if the individual is non-speaking, due to ways of communication that the individual has, right? Maybe they have nonverbal methods of communication, like an AAC device. Maybe they've drawn pictures of the things that they have, seen or thought or so on. There are a lot of different ways that this could be communicated as well as thinking about is there emotional distress linked to specific triggers? So for Ava, right, it was the car, being in the car, that was the trigger that really made her distressed, and it brought out specific repetitive behaviors that were very sort of specific in nature. 3 times tapping, right? Which is very different than just tapping toys on her teeth, just generally when she's engaging in sensory play. Are there any illogical beliefs related to the behavior? And so this is where that number 3 comes in, right? We don't know what Ava believes about that number 3, but it seems important because it's coming up a lot for her. So we can kind of infer there's some sort of meaning to that. Do the repetitive behaviors present as urgent rituals, right? Is this something that they feel pressured to do in the moment that they need to complete, or is it something that's kind of just happening? Do the behaviors appear enjoyable, calming, or sensory driven? What happens if the behavior is interrupted? So for this one, we talked about how if someone's trying to regulate and engaging in stimming, if you interrupt them, they might be distressed and they might want to keep engaging in that stim, or sometimes they can be redirected to another activity, right? If an OCD ritual is interrupted, often the individual needs to start again from the beginning. So if they need to do something a certain number of times, they can't just continue, they have to start over again. It's a little different. And then the last question, how interfering is the behavior in daily living? And this is really important because we never want to be taking away behaviors that an individual has that are serving a function for them, that they enjoy, that are calming for them, that are fun for them. Um, all of Ava's stimming, her water play, all of that is stuff that we want to support for her. Maybe plugging the sink is something we want her to maybe not engage in as much, right? But the water play specifically is not something that we want to take away from her, right? However, when we're thinking about the distressing behavior she has related to the car ride, right? Tapping on the seatbelt, closing the door, um, they might not appear that interfering at first, but they're distressing to her, right? She's doing them because they're distressed. And so here we want to give her a better way of dealing with that distress than those tapping things. It's not just about taking away those behaviors from her life, it's about helping her diminish that distress in those situations in a healthier way. And that's where we want that differentiation, right, for treatment. So here are some patterns that we can see to suggest that a specific behavior is linked to an obsessive thought. If there's preceding anxiety or visible stress before the behavior happens, if someone's avoiding specific triggers or seeking frequent reassurance about them, if the behavior is not enjoyable or entertaining, and sometimes the individual will try to resist or hide the behavior from others. And this is a clue that this is something that they have some sort of insight in, that, they don't want to be doing this. They don't want other people to be seeing it. There's a lot of stigma that can come with mental health diagnoses, and this is especially compounded for individuals with autism or intellectual disability, because of this idea of multiple diagnoses, right? Someone might think, okay, my child already has this huge diagnostic label on them. I don't want to be giving them more, right? I don't want to be labeling them more, having people think worse about them. And unfortunately, there is stigma in our community related to mental health. And so part of this process is also understanding that mental health is just something everyone manages, and wellness is something that we need to be promoting for everyone, right? And unfortunately, right, like I think this idea of diagnostic labeling becomes more salient for our kiddos who are more profoundly impaired, right? We don't want to be setting them up for failure. But at the same time, we want to be giving them the support they need to be successful. So I've talked to a lot of parents who kind of wrestle with this question and wrestle with this decision making. And I am so empathetic to it because I am fully aware that someone hearing that your child has OCD puts an idea in their mind about them, right? What I would like to share, though, is that you can pursue a mental health diagnosis without disclosing it to other people and have it be something that's only within your specific care team, right? And you can communicate to them about how you want it to be spoken about. Maybe you don't even want to use the term OCD. Maybe you want to talk about it differently with your family, right? And these are decisions that you can make with your care team and with your family altogether. And I'll pass it over to Jessica for this part.
Yeah, so first I wanted to speak to the idea of a stigma, or what I like to refer to as social stigma, because though it's a word that's used often, I don't think a lot of people truly understand the definition of stigma. So social stigma, as it pertains to autism and disabilities, refers to the negative stereotypes, the prejudices, and discriminatory attitudes that society holds against individuals who are neurodivergent or disabled. This stigma often leads to social exclusion, reduced opportunities or access, and internalized shame for those that are affected. So, stereotyping, for instance, would be assuming all autistic or disabled people have the same way or have the same limited capabilities. But as we know, that's not true. Autism is a spectrum, and there are a wide variety of individuals with different autistic profiles and different needs for support. Discrimination. People with autism might be treated differently or unfairly in education, within the workplace, or like as Dr. Maya was saying, even within healthcare based on their one diagnosis. It's really challenging for pediatricians and a lot of the service providers that we've worked with to date to understand that Ava might have additional co-occurring, diagnosis criteria that it's not necessarily autism. And it's like, it's tough because I don't want to be that parent that's like, I'm going to educate you on my child. But at the end of the day, it does require kind of perspective and lived experience to share with your care team so that they can really truly understand what is needed to support the whole person and the whole family unit. Labeling often comes up as well. That reduces somebody's identity to their disability, rather than recognizing them again as just a simple human being that might just need a little bit more help. Social avoidance. This is what families go through a lot, and it's one of the major reasons why we started the Ava Sophia Foundation, which is Autism Moms of Kona is our trade name. Um, it is avoiding interaction or friendship because you're often misunderstood in the community. And so it really is like debilitating. At one point, I was that mom that refused to leave the couch, even to go to Target, because I didn't want that constant like staring or being misunderstood in the social environment. But a lot of us parents also come together and talk about these things, which is really important. And so we came to realize that we were referring to it as our pity potty. There's a certain period of time where you can sit on your pity potty and you can feel bad about your situation, but at some point you need to get up, you need to take charge because everybody deserves to be a part of their community and to build healthy relationships with mutual respect. And lastly, again, that stigma can deepen in the sense that it turns into internalized stigma. And so that's when individuals start to believe the negative societal messages about themselves, which can harm their mental health and self-esteem. And so, in essence, social stigma creates barriers to inclusion and dignity and equal participation in community life. And so addressing it requires awareness and acceptance, education, and systemic changes to foster acceptance and equity. And that is the majority of what our organization strives to do in a culturally relevant way that is specific to the community that we live in. So we're very grateful to be where we're at today. So back to the slide though, really identifying all of those challenges that people experience with stigma, you really need to embrace the power of empathy and compassion. So, empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings, thoughts, or experiences of another person. It involves both recognizing what someone else is going through and emotionally connecting with their experience. But to us advocating on behalf of our families and working together to create a more equitable experience in our community. The next level, really, for us is compassion. And that's the emotional response of caring for someone who is suffering, combined with a desire to help and alleviate that suffering. So it goes beyond empathy by not just feeling or understanding another's pain, but also being motivated to take action to relieve it. And so I'm very grateful for our community. We have so many volunteers and contributors that support our mission and a lot of the things that we're doing within the community, because not only do they accept responsibility for feeling and understanding somebody else's pain without pitying them or feeling bad for them, but they're rising above to say, I understand what you're going through because that's part of the human experience, but it then is my kuleana. It then is a part of my social responsibility to rise above and become the best version of myself so that I can take action and give back to those that need my help and need my support. So, a perfect example of this is when we walk in all of our parades, mainly the King Kamehameha Day parade. A lot of the people that are walking with Autism Moms of Kona are not moms. You know, they're best friends of mine from high school. They're co-workers. They're people with within community partner organizations. They're all understanding that some kids can't withstand that parade environment that's incredibly overstimulating. So they're standing up and holding the banner and helping to represent what we stand for in the community. And that's one of my favorite activities throughout the year. Um, And so I just wanted to end with a saying that I saw on social media. It said, indigenous cultures saw mental illness as an imbalance, not a disorder. Isolation was never used like in modern psychology. They used community, ritual, and nature to heal. Maybe the primitive ones weren't them, but us. So again, it's that idea of what really regulates you, what really grounds you as a human being, and how can you come to center collectively to find healing, to be the best rendition and version of yourself. So. And so, one of my favorite quotes actually is by Rodeo Denise. He has been a member of our organization and he is one of our strongest self advocates. He's actually 18 now. And so he said, when speaking to me while we were preparing for one of his speeches, he said, for some, people can ask you questions and you can answer them. And that's as it pertains to his life experience being an autistic individual. But for others, they can't talk. So it's up to us to answer the questions to help them. So for him, he often answers questions about what it's like living with autism. And he sees that need because he knows that Ava has a problem with expressing and even speaking on her own behalf. And so it's just a beautiful thing. He said the best way to do this is to understand their behavior, to understand Ava's behavior so you know how to help them. Ava can grow as fast or as slow as she likes, but it's important for her to see the things that she likes that brings her joy and that ends up with self-love. And so it's like this brings a lot of people to tears when they hear him do his speech because we're all learning that pursuit for self-love. And he's so wise in his years. So, so grateful to know him. And the next slide, I think, is a picture of him with all of our kiddos in one of our paddle boarding experiences. So he's an excellent leader, and we're lucky to call him part of our ohana.
Thanks, Jessica. I love those quotations. I think they're so powerful. Um, I've talked a lot about how there is a need for more knowledge about OCD in the field of developmental conditions and in the mental health field, more knowledge about autism. This is really important. And so we're going to go through some case examples. And my guess is that people viewing this presentation, just like our audience at the SPIN conference, will leave this presentation being better at differentiating between autism and OCD than most mental health professionals out there. And I say this pretty confidently, based on research in the field about how most people don't know very much about this, but also in my interpersonal experiences. And so I'm going to show some case examples, and I want you to keep in mind this is about just, differentiation. Not all the information has been gathered for you. You're not the assessor having to probe for all of this. But I want you to differentiate between if you think this is just autism, so that's going to be number one, um, just OCD, so number two, or if it's both, and that's going to be a three. And so you can kind of think to yourself as you're listening to these, and I'll give you the answers when we're all done with the case examples. Okay, so case example number one. This name is fictional, right? So Liam, a 7-year-old boy, has difficulty with peer interactions and frequent meltdowns during transitions at school. He is highly verbal, but tends to monologue about his interests, airplanes, without responding to social cues. Liam lines up toys at home, insists on eating with the same plate and spoon daily, and becomes distressed when routines change. He does not report any internal distress or fears related to his routines. His repetitive behaviors appear calming and sensory driven. So this is our case example number one. Number two, Jasmine, a 12-year-old girl, presents with increasing anxiety, taking over an hour to leave the house each morning due to repeated checking of doors, light switches, and her backpack. She reports intense fears of, quote, something bad happening, quote, if she doesn't complete these rituals just right. She is aware the fears are irrational but feels unable to stop, and there are no signs of social communication difficulties or sensory sensitivities. Number 2. And number 3, Koa is a 10-year-old child referred for evaluation due to difficulties with communication and escalating distress at school. Koa has some words, but mostly communicates with an AAC device. Each morning, he insists on tapping the four corners of the classroom in a specific sequence before sitting down. If this routine is interrupted, he becomes extremely agitated, screams, and attempts to start the sequence over from the beginning. Parents report that his rituals have become increasingly rigid and disruptive at home and school. He also lines up toys while playing and flaps his hands when excited. Okay. Let's go back to number 1. So this is a kiddo who I would say only meets criteria for autism just based on this short description, right? We can see some of the hallmarks of autism, these peer interaction difficulties, lining up toys, some of those repetitive behaviors, need for routine, consistency, but we don't see any indication that these are linked to obsessions, and these repetitive behaviors don't appear to be compulsive because they're not distressing. Number 2, so Jasmine, I would say this is a girl who has just OCD, right? No communication challenges or social communication challenges, which kind of has us not really looking at the autism category for her. But this pattern of behaviors with checking and everything suggests OCD. And when she's talking about a fear of something bad happening, that is our obsession. So she's able to describe that verbally for us. And number 3, Koa, this is a kiddo who I would consider for both, right? He has some hallmarks of having obsessions and compulsions when we see him tapping the four corners of the classroom in a specific sequence. Because it's happening so specifically and he has to repeat it when he's interrupted, suggests that it's a compulsion rather than a repetitive behavior that is sensory driven or interest driven. So congratulations. If you were able to identify all of those correctly, you are more qualified than most mental health professionals in doing this process. So wonderful. I want you to take this knowledge and spread it for other people, right? But I have some treatment considerations really quickly, and we'll start with Jessica for this.
And so, going back to Ava and really understanding how to help her, our centering thought is to find balance for her and for everyone in our family. So again, it goes back to understanding the function of the behavior. Why is this behavior, presenting itself, and what's the cause of it? Is it distressing or is it calming and bringing her joy? Again, we don't want to block anything that might be serving that regulating piece that she's missing. I also feel it's really important to advocate on behalf of Ava for the importance of a multidisciplinary approach. So what this means is, there are a lot of complications with supporting Ava in the educational setting and just in building functional communication and life skills. And I found it incredibly important, and I hope that there's more opportunities for providers to be collaborating with each other in building a plan to serve this individual. So, like an occupational therapist, which really looks at the sensory profile, working with a speech therapist to, create environments where that person feels calm and then feels more willing to open up and have that expressive communication. Also, it's important for both of these providers to be able to work with behavioral interventionists because, again, an ABA or RBT therapist might be used to blocking a certain behavior seen as a problem, but you want to understand that yes, I'm trying to keep Ava safe. I'm not trying to have her running out in the street and elope. I'm also not trying to have her destroy our vanity in the bathroom because a lot of, water can create water damage. So you have to look at the function of the behavior, but find a replacement, appropriate behavior to redirect her towards so that her natural internal instincts are satiated and she really is accommodated and supported. And so that kind of brings me to my next step is as Ava's mother, I'm consistently working with my care team to identify areas where she might be struggling and experiencing masking and burnout. Because over the years, I saw elopement and I saw these like natural stimming behaviors. But as she goes through different behavioral interventions, I see a lot of blocking, I see a lot of redirection, and I've seen the stimming reduce because she is being ushered into this idea of compliance. So not only are we talking about, okay, you person with autism have to look in my eyes and make that eye contact, we're also looking at, things that bring Ava joy specific to her. So she's tapping her teeth and she's playing with her food with her hands, and people are like, that's socially inappropriate. We want to block it. We want to improve it. And as her parent, I do too, because I want to be able to go to a restaurant and have, a good experience. But at the same time, what am I doing to support that need, that internal need? So, what other sensory activities am I providing for her so she has that need met? And so, again, over the years, I've seen, a lot of masking, which is leading to burnout. So, autistic burnout is like a state of intense physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion that occurs in autistic individuals due to chronic stress, sensory overload, social pressure, masking, and unmet needs over time. It's not the same as general burnout. Autistic burnout is neurological and often includes a loss of skills or functioning. So, if you look deeper into the symptoms of burnout, you might see extreme fatigue or increased sensory sensitivities to input like lights and noises and touch, and also potentially regressions or an increase in shutdowns or meltdowns, and then a need to withdraw quicker from social or daily activities. So it's just this increase of data and pressure that's put on this individual that is causing them to burn out. And when I'm speaking to Ava's care team, I really want them to be aware and conscious of ways that she might be escalating and going towards that burnout. You know, um, Behavioral intervention has helped us a lot. It's helped Ava develop toileting skills and functional life skills, but there needs to be balance. And burnout and masking over the years, I do think is a true contributor towards some of more that distress, that memory. And also, maybe some could see it as trauma. That would lead to the anxiety related to her OCD tendencies. And so it's just really interesting when you think about that. And again, it just comes back to balance. Being open, being providing perspective, but also learning from others and working collaboratively together to support that individual and not necessarily turning down anyone that's trying to help build a life for your loved one. So. I do want to share too, a major success for Ava was actually within the educational system. She goes to Kahakai Elementary. And so there was this specific instance where, again, we were at an IEP meeting and this goes back to presuming competence for her. So Ava was in fifth grade this year, and she was still being included in settings that were with children that were more in the first or second grade category because that matched her intellectual capacity. But I just felt like, she deserved to interact with her peers and have that normal experience within education. And so I really advocated for her to be able to attend SFA with peers that were her age. And it was interesting because you saw this experience where she went from having a meltdown after 3 or 5 minutes and needing to leave the classroom to eventually being able to attend and engage a full SFA class with for almost 30 minutes. And therefore, she's being exposed to rich content and the same literature that her peers are, you know, um, also learning. And that's true access in education, and that's what everybody deserves. And so, because of that growth, both within her IEP team, that multidisciplinary team within the school, and also with her peers, everybody grew for the better. And she was able to take the alt assessment and finish all of the questions without needing to leave the table. And she's just been more happy and present with her peers. And I think again, supporting her and providing equity again just builds a better life for her. So that was definitely a win.
Thank you. So I'm going to switch a little bit to some evidence-based practices that we have for OCD. So these are things that we have established through research to be effective treatments for OCD. And this is why it's important for us to consider OCD as a diagnosis, or really think about what an individual could benefit from in terms of therapies. So cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, this is something that people often hear about in relation to depression and anxiety, but it's also really helpful with OCD, which we consider a form of anxiety. So this is a type of therapy that typically requires strong verbal skills because a lot of it is talk-based, and there's a focus on kind of challenging your unhelpful thoughts and behaviors and going through that internal process. There's another intervention called exposure and response prevention, or ERP. And this is a separate sort of procedure that can be part of CBT. It can also be part of ABA or other therapeutic procedures, or it can be done alone. And so this is a process where someone is gradually exposed to the situations that make them feel anxious and scared while resisting their compulsive behaviors and engaging in other calming activities instead. So gradually helping someone face some of those anxieties, learn alternative coping mechanisms to kind of fade out those compulsive behaviors. ABA, or applied behavioral analysis, is something that a lot of people are probably familiar with. But what you probably don't know is that there are a lot of procedures within ABA that are specifically designed to treat compulsions and OCD. So ERP can be very much part of the ABA kind of ideology and procedures, but they also have other behavioral procedures such as gradual exposure, differential reinforcement, token economies, etc., that can be specifically applied to treat compulsions. And so the difference in how someone is treating someone in ABA therapy generally versus ABA used for OCD tendencies is in how these concepts are being applied, right? The behaviors they're targeting, the target that they have, the goals that they set for the individual, and those are going to look very different than if they're working on teaching daily living skills, teaching language skills, etc. So it just looks different, but using the same sort of approach and techniques.
I do want to speak toward this as well because our ABA team with Platter Behavioral, or their clinic is called Ho'okele ABA, has done an excellent job as we've learned more about Ava's OCD tendencies. So even their different approaches can vary based on what stage of you know the treatment she's in. So some days she's having an off day, a difficult day, they'll immediately adjust and consider her sensory needs. Whereas other days she's happy and more, attending more and stuff. And that's when they build, specific skills and life skills during those times when she's most receptive and enjoying an interaction. So, big shout out to them again for identifying again the sensory needs for her after learning from the occupational therapist, as well as being very receptive towards the function of the behavior, which switches their ABA approach at that given time.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I think this also speaks to what you were saying before about the importance of a multidisciplinary team, right? I've worked with a lot of ABA providers who are working with kiddos that I've done assessments with, and they become the main treatment providers for OCD, right? In consultation and me kind of pointing out the things that I observed during the assessment and the behaviors I identified as really being compulsive. And then they're kind of able to rally and really use their knowledge base to kind of address it. And so if you are an ABA provider and you don't know very much about OCD, right, I do have some resources for you to kind of learn a bit more on how you can apply what you already know and your own expertise to helping people with these tendencies. And if you are a parent working with an ABA team and you suspect that your child has these compulsions, right, talk about it with your ABA team and talk about what you learned here and why you think so, and really bring that up as a continual conversation, right, to pursue and keep in mind when they're working with your child. Um, Here are some treatment adaptations that are often done. I mentioned that, CBT is often very verbally based, and so sometimes it needs specific adaptations in working with individuals on the autism spectrum. Some of these adaptations are things like using visual supports, using concrete language, not so much of those, abstract analogies that sometimes are used, incorporating special interests and using sort of that collaborative team-based care model. So for professionals who are in the mental health field and are skilled in CBT, knowing that you can take your area of expertise and adapt it to meet the needs of people on the autism spectrum is really important here too, right? You have an area of knowledge and expertise that can really serve this population, and it just takes some really small, slight adjustments to make these treatments appropriate. So both areas of providers, I think you already have what you need to be treating OCD in individuals with autism, right? It's just a matter of learning a bit more and learning how your skill set applies. I do want to mention that there is another evidence-based treatment for OCD, and this is psychopharmacology, so specifically SSRIs. And so these are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Some common ones, you probably know the brand names, Prozac, Lexapro. Here are some, generic names too. But these are medications that are typically used for anxiety and depression. OCD is very effectively treated by SSRIs. These work by increasing serotonin availability in the brain. And remember, we talked about that serotonin dysregulation as being a feature of OCD and autism. And so this can help with mood and reduce obsessive thoughts and compulsions. And we see this work in children with adolescents with autism. But my recommendation is that medication is always done in conjunction with behavioral or emotional therapy, and that you always start at really low doses and monitor for side effects. So being really cautious about how you use this and making sure it's not your only intervention protocol. Pass it over to Jessica.
And then again, within the household and our community, the key components for quality care is ensuring that there are a few things established in your everyday life. So one is accommodation, really ensuring that accommodations are made for people with disabilities in as many places as possible. And this includes the increase in sensory-friendly environments and considerations, and especially within the classrooms and outside of the classrooms. Safety, we always want to think about safety first before we then build out ways to attend to an individual with with autism or a similar disability. So first you attend to making sure they don't elope and making sure they don't have free access to a pool, because safety first. And then from there, you are able to find ways to provide access to those types of activities in a safe way. Ensuring security. So really supporting your loved one to make sure that they feel secure and safe in places. So it's not just our responsibility to make sure that the environment is safe, but also that they do feel safe, like when Ava is riding in the car, and really talking through those situations with them, maybe through social stories, which builds confidence and understanding in the events that might happen in certain situations. Um, and then really focusing on activities and opportunities, not only for the individual, but for the family to experience well-being. So I always talk to a lot of the families in our group. If you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling stressed, take the roof off over your head, go out in nature and connect to the rest of the world and remember what's important. And so anytime you go out in the sunshine or in nature where there's a lot of trees, you tend to feel a sense of calm and grounding, and you can always rely on, the wonders of the world and the magic beyond what we might simply know, to bring you some grounding. And then that then leads to regulation. So, making sure you prioritize regulation, not only sensory regulation, but then how it, spills into your need for nervous system consistency and regulation. And then that word popped up, consistency, making sure you're consistently supporting yourself, your loved ones, and your family, showing up for yourself first and showing up for everybody in the family. So, in a consistent way, because we want to make sure that you're getting the support you need so that it does not increase and end up in unresolved burnout or chronic stress. You need to be proactive in your well-being and care.
And lastly, we're just going to wrap up with some resources that we recommend for people. So these are some resources for families. I have two workbooks that are great, one for young kids and others for teens and young adults. And these are things that you can work on individually or, with family support or, with the support of another care team member. So the first one is what to do when your brain gets stuck. Really great, and challenge your OCD, which is a CBT-based workbook. And here, Jessica.
Yeah, support groups, therapeutic alternatives, and community advocacy. These are just a few of the things that we do with the Ava Sophia Foundation. So we actually have a chapter in Kona called Autism Moms of Kona. But we've expanded to the east side of the island. So we're better known as the Ava Sophia Foundation, the Hilo chapter, and we are just launching a Leeward chapter on Oahu. And so, feel free to reach out through our main website, autismmomsofkona.com. But we do provide a lot of programs which all are focused on supporting the individual family units, but also increasing community acceptance and community opportunities with business community partners. Say community a lot, sorry.
I didn't know that you were coming here to Leeward Side. That's great.
That started from Spin. Tends to happen every year
Nice.
at Spin. So thank you. Big shout out to Susan and Amanda.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have a lot of families over there that I'll refer to you. Yeah. Here are just some resources for providers. So the International OCD Foundation, their website has a bunch of really wonderful free on-demand trainings and webinars on OCD where you can learn more about it. And then if you're a mental health professional, there's this wonderful book called OCD and Autism, A Clinician's Guide to Adapting CBT, that kind of really walks you through the process of adaptive considerations and different ways of kind of conceptualizing how you can teach the information that you would normally sort of verbally describe. So really wonderful resources. And what I hope is the takeaway is that, right, like this is something that is very common in our autistic population, and we can do better to serve them in those needs with very little extra effort, just some very careful intention. So I'm really hoping that if you're a provider, you'll learn more about OCD or about autism, whatever it is that you need some extra support in. For families, I really hope that you are able to advocate for increased awareness amongst autism, amongst both mental health professionals and vice versa, advocating for mental health understanding amongst autism service providers, and really trying to promote these integrated plans, right, that are individualized, that really take in consideration what a person needs holistically, instead of thinking about them as siloed things.
And then our vision for Ava's future and what we're working to build within our community. We really, really want improved access and quality care for Ava. We want less silos. We're really focused on, again, that multidisciplinary service provision that is focused on sustainability and continual improvement. So research is constantly changing, and it's important to, keep a good pulse on the new ways of understanding and supporting individuals with autism and other intellectual disabilities. We really embrace cultural perpetuation and the research and neuroscience behind cultural practices. And so we're really looking at ways, especially that the Native Hawaiian culture can contribute to our definition of well-being. And in turn, that really lends to the perpetuation of our culture, really just sharing the way we choose to live our life. And hopefully that can enhance the lives of others that we come into contact with. And then lastly, our big approach is really looking at an intentional living community that is culturally relevant and available to the public. So we're thinking about Ava's future and Ava's future after we as her parents are gone. And that's the hardest question for any caregiver to ask. And so, what we really want is to continue to build that intentional living community so she has a safe space to go, both emotionally and, logistically, once we're gone. And the only way to do that is to be directly involved with our community and to continue to build the importance of that village. They say it takes a village to raise a child. For us, it takes a community to really raise a child with special needs. And so, with that, we really appreciate anybody that is willing to learn and to grow alongside with us.
Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. Here I have some references if you want to nerd out and learn more about some of the scientific articles that I used. There are also a couple of great websites referenced here, so go ahead and take a screenshot if you want to look at this. But um, really, please reach out to both Jessica or myself if you have any questions. Unfortunately, we can't do a live Q&A here like we would in person, but I think both of us are very welcome to those sort of blind emails and calls. So feel free to reach out if you would like to.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.